Your alarm goes off, you already resent it before your eyes are open. There's an inbox somewhere with your name on it, a commute waiting to eat an hour of your life, and a to-do list that never actually ends. You'll clock out around 6, maybe later, and call that a good day. Now picture clocking out at 1 in the afternoon, every day, for your entire species' history. That's not a fantasy. That's roughly how the math worked out for most of the people who ever lived. For 99% of human history, this wasn't a hypothetical, and it wasn't a myth either. In 1963 and 1964, an anthropologist named Richard Lee spent months living with the hoansi, sometimes called the Kung, in the Dobe area of the Kalahari Desert. He didn't guess at how hard their lives were. He timed it. He tracked exactly how many hours the adults spent hunting, gathering, and processing food, week after week. The number he came back with was about 15 hours. 15 hours a week, to meet their caloric needs. Not 15 hours a day, a week. Sit with that for a second. A modern full-time job in the United States runs somewhere north of 40 hours a week, every week, for most of your adult life. Lee's hoansi were putting in a third of that, and they weren't starving. They were, by every measure he could take, well fed. Here's where it gets interesting. Lee wasn't the only one who found this. Decades later, an anthropologist named James Suzman went back and lived with the hoansi himself, and documented it in his book, Affluence Without Abundance, published in 2017. The low labor hours weren't a fluke of one bad measurement in one dry season. They held up. So why does almost nobody know this? Because it breaks a story we've been told since childhood. The story where cavemen spent every waking hour one bad afternoon away from starving to death, clawing existence out of a hostile world, and only civilization saved us from that grind. It's a good story. It's just not the one the data tells. In 1972, an anthropologist named Marshall Sahlins took Lee's numbers and ran with them in an essay that became famous in the field. He called it Stone Age economics, and in it, he coined a phrase that still gets quoted today: the original affluent society. Here's his argument, and it's stranger than it sounds. Affluence isn't about having a lot. It's about wanting little relative to what you already have. A forager who needs 15 hours a week and has exactly that isn't poor. A modern worker who needs 40 hours a week, gets 40 hours a week, and still wants more, is running on a treadmill that was never designed to stop. Scarcity, Sahlins argued, isn't a natural fact of human existence. It's something that gets manufactured, mostly by wanting more than you have. Let that sit for a second, because it flips the whole story upside down. We weren't the desperate ones. We might be now. So what did your ancestors actually do with the other hours in the day? This is where the practical lens turns into a social one, because the leisure time wasn't wasted. Picture a hunter coming back to camp in the early afternoon after a successful morning. The kill is shared out. There's no boss to report to, no shift to clock into next. The rest of the group is already at the fire, and this is where the actual work of being human happens. Storytelling, gossip, teaching children, arguing about who owes who a favor, singing, resting. Anthropologists who've studied foraging bands consistently find that a huge slice of waking hours went into exactly this kind of social maintenance. Not laziness, relationship infrastructure, the stuff that keeps 30 or 40 people from killing each other over the winter. There was no existential dread about an inbox. There was, presumably, still drama. Some things about people never change. But it gets stranger. If foragers had this much free time and this little forced labor, why did anyone ever switch to farming? Why did we choose the harder path? Here's the twist almost nobody wants to hear. We probably didn't choose it, and it probably wasn't easier. Around 12,000 years ago, in the region called the Fertile Crescent, agriculture started to spread. And when bioarchaeologists studied skeletons from early farming sites like Abu Hureyra in Syria, they didn't find evidence of newfound comfort. They found the opposite: shorter stature, worse dental health, joints worn down from repetitive grinding motions, the kind you'd get from spending hours a day bent over a quernstone, turning grain into flour by hand, over and over, for years. Agriculture didn't reduce the workload. It multiplied it, and it locked people into that workload in a way foraging never did, because now there were crops that needed tending on someone else's schedule, not the weather's. So here's the two-figure contrast worth sitting with. A hoansi hunter finishing his work by early afternoon, spending the rest of the day at the fire with people he's known his whole life, and a Neolithic farmer at Abu Hureyra, thousands of years later, still bent over that same quernstone at dusk, whose skeleton would carry the evidence of that grind long after he was gone. Same species, same basic drive to survive. Wildly different number of hours it cost them, and wildly different lives on the other side of those hours. Why did we do it then? The honest answer is, we don't know exactly, and anyone who tells you with total confidence why agriculture won out is oversimplifying a messy, gradual, region-by-region process that took generations. What we do know is this: agriculture produced a surplus, and a surplus can be stored, taxed, and controlled by someone who isn't the person who grew it. That's not a small detail. That's the seed of hierarchy, of rulers, of the very concept of an employer. Foragers didn't have a boss because there wasn't a stockpile worth guarding. Farmers did, eventually, whether they wanted one or not. Reindeer herders in parts of the world would later domesticate animals for similar reasons, trading a wandering, lower labor existence for a controllable, storable one. Honestly, respect for the animals in that story. They didn't ask for any of it either. This isn't a fringe theory, as much as it might sound like one watching your own calendar fill up with meetings that could have been an email. The 40-hour week you take for granted isn't ancient. It isn't natural. It's a relatively recent arrangement, and it exists because someone benefits from you working that many hours, not because your body or your needs require it. We didn't invent the 9 to 5 because we needed it. We invented it because someone else needed us to. That's the opinion this video is willing to stake, and it's not really a fringe one among people who study this for a living. The data keeps pointing the same direction. So what do you do with that, on a random Tuesday, staring down another 8-hour shift? Probably not quit your job over a Kalahari time use study from 1963, but maybe the resentment you feel toward your alarm clock isn't a personal failing. Maybe it's a completely rational response to a schedule that's a few thousand years old at most, layered on top of bodies and brains built for something else entirely. Your ancestors weren't primitive. They weren't scraping by in constant desperation, waiting for civilization to rescue them from the dirt. In a lot of ways, they had already solved the problem you're still fighting with. They just solved it before anyone had a reason to convince them that more hours meant more worth. Your alarm goes off again tomorrow. Maybe it still gets you out of bed at the same time, but maybe you notice, just for a second, that the resentment isn't yours. It's borrowed. It's a few thousand years old, and it was never actually about survival. So here's the question worth sitting with in the comments. If you only had to work 15 hours this week to meet your needs, what would you actually do with the other 25? Tell me honestly. I'll read them.